Hi all, let's continue our series on the secrets of chess tactics. There's a playlist you might want to search for, Secrets of Chess Tactics by Kingscrusher. So let's go and look at back row mates now. So back row mates, we'll click Start Puzzles at Chess World. A back row mate is when you back row checkmate the opponent, the king, with either queen or rook. Funny enough, because it can't be the other pieces, it has to be a horizontal check usually for that back row to be mate. So here, this is a classic brilliancy example. Let's go into big board mode, so hopefully you can analyze a bit easier this larger board here. So white to play here. You might want to pause the video now and work this out if you can. It's very, very difficult actually. Okay, the first move of this absolute brilliancy is Queen G4. Yeah, so if the Queen had taken, then Rook takes was a back row mate after taking checkmate. Now here it continues absolutely brilliantly with Queen C4, trying to deflect the Queen or Rook away from E8. Now Queen C7, and now this is a really delicate touch here in this position. You might think that to try and deflect the Queen away from E8, Queen takes B7. That doesn't work very well. In fact, it would backfire to Queen takes E2, and White would be getting back row mated after Rook takes check, and then White's getting back row mated. So in fact, the first move here is very, very interesting. A4, deflecting the Queen away from that tactic. Now Rook E4, and now this works very, very well. Queen takes B7, and black is defenseless now. The Queen can't go to A4, can't take there. There's no taking on E2 here. There's no taking there because of Queen takes. Yeah, back row mate is a major theme of this puzzle for both white and black. Okay, that's an absolute classic example. Now here, can you see, if you want to pause the video now, I'll give you a few seconds after I say that. Okay, Rook takes G7 for Queen F7 check. And we have Queen F8, back row checkmate. Here, you might want to pause the video here. The first check is fairly straightforward, as you might imagine, but now, pause here in particular. Okay, Rook takes F8, Knight F5 check takes away those two escape squares, and it looks as though the king's still got an escape square on H7. So the clever bit here is Queen F8. So that now Rook D8 is checkmate. This position, we're in check, so king takes. And isn't it desperate, this position? Isn't King G8 desperate? Knight H6, aren't we just absolutely losing there? Let's have a look before we resign this. King G8. Is it resignable after Knight H6 check? Do we resign here or not? Black to play. You might want to pause the video. Okay. Queen takes H6. Wonderful saving tactics. Knight E2 check, dragging the king away from protecting the rook, and it's a disaster for white. On that back row, if only the king had made air earlier, made luft with H3, this wouldn't exist, this horrible backfire. So sometimes that's a very important form of prophylaxis when you make air for your king. This lack of escape squares has been exploited. Now here, if we play bishop takes, yes, that backfires to rook takes, and we're getting back row mated ourselves here. What can black do? You might want to pause the video. Okay, rook g8. Now, that was hitting the queen. If queen takes, there's queen e1 or queen g1 there, getting a back row mate eventually. And if rook takes, there was queen g1 check supported by the rook, and after taking, still a back row mate. So check here though, and now can you see what black plays? Okay, rook c1 check for queen takes c1 checkmate. Fun one there. White play a nice little move which basically wins, winning advantage. Pause here. Okay, bishop b8, disconnecting the rooks, threatening queen takes rook, and now queen takes is possible because of the back row mate issue. No heir for the king. So if it carried on, then there's checkmate there coming up. This you might have seen before, classic. It starts off with check. And now you might want to pause this if you haven't seen this before. Okay, rook g1 check, queen e1. And you might think, what's the point of this? The king's always... How is the king getting mated here, you might think? Because isn't the king getting g2 if we sack the queen on two of the squares? But there's another square. We can get the bishop involved. Queen f1, getting the bishop involved. Cutting out escape squares usefully. And now checkmate. Wonderful stuff. Here, black to play. Very powerful forcing moves one should always consider in calculation. Especially checks, prioritize checks to calculate, as the opponent has very limited replies to checks quite often. Okay, pause here if needed. Queen takes f3, check, bishop h3, bishop h4, and back row checkmate soon after this. Rook takes f1, checkmate. Here, complex example. Pause here if needed. It looks as though we're being attacked with g takes. This looks very dangerous. If g3, g takes, and queen takes g3 is threatened even, and that g file looks ferocious. So white acts quickly here. Bishop h6. And now not queen b1 because there's bishop b6. So knocking out a defender as well. Now we're threatening checkmate. And that's desperate. We can take here. And that is occupying an escape square for checkmate there. Okay, how do we rescue the knight here? It's pinned, it's double attacked. Are we just losing the knight? Pause here if needed. Knight c3. Yep, and now there's rook b1, checkmate. This position is white getting some sort of perpetual check. It looks pretty dangerous, but black resolves the issue with queen takes f1. As after taking, there's bishop b5 check, and this is pushing the king back where it's got no heir. Rook e1, checkmate. This position, quite beautiful. You might want to pause the video, work this out. Okay. Queen takes d7 check, clearance of the e file for knight c7, and rook d8, a kind of Morphy style opera mate with rook and bishop. Okay, here the queen is fortunately protecting h7, so actually I know there's a very dangerous form pawn as well, but we can threaten the mate. Form pawn's not always winning every game. And now can you see? Might want to pause the video. Queen takes b1. Yes, the king's lack of heir here means it's going to be a back row checkmate after knight c1 taking. Nice one here. Pause if needed. Queen e7, threatening queen f8 checkmate. And that isn't actually parried here. If takes, there was rook f8 checkmate. But now queen f8 here, rook takes checkmate. Nice example here. Pause if needed. Rook takes c3. Now this looks like a clever response, because if queen takes, then queen takes c3. But can black do better? The king is lacking heir. That should be a clue. Something might be up when there's a lack of escape squares of the opponent's king. Okay, rook b3. Trying to play for rook takes b1, mating there on queen takes. And now rook takes b1, and actually just winning material. Rook up. Very nice. Gregorich. That's a duplicate, pardon me. Okay. Alekhine against Colin. Knight takes, I'll take you to the critical position here. Check. Now what do you play in this position? Okay, the best move, the absolute best move, is queen takes d6. Yeah, that's actually absolutely winning, because of the check and then taking here. It would be a whole piece up. It's much stronger. We'll see in a moment. That is the much stronger than the immediate knight f7 check. So if we look at this position in particular, knight f7 just wins the exchanger. So queen takes d6, knocking out that defensive f8 basically after knight f7. If takes check is going to be mating, otherwise winning the queen piece up. This position, there's a loose piece which should signal there might be some tactical issues to celebrate. Tactical liabilities like loose pieces, lack of escape squares are tactical liabilities or issues to celebrate. You might want to pause the video. What does white play here? Okay, queen f5 hitting that loose piece, threatening queen c8 checkmate as well. And now here, king's got a lack of escape squares. Queen f8 is mating. Floor against Thomas there. Solo floor. White to play here. Pause if needed. Knight takes d5, offering the queen. Now not rook b8 check because of taking this king d7, but actually throwing in the bishop to help cover the escape squares. Rook b8, and you might think, well, hold on a sec. The king's got d7. This is where the bishop still comes in to play its part. Bishop c8 check. Bishop takes e8 is a back row mate. Wonderful stuff. Now here, knight takes b4, check, check, and essentially mate here. Now that's the king's not technically on the back row there. That's a bit naughty to throw that one in, but it's great fun anyway. This position, you might want to pause. Kasparov game against Mephisto, an early computer. Rook takes g7, bishop check, and now bringing the queen in, bishop g7. So if the king hadn't taken, there's horrible things like queen h6. Now queen g5, queen h6, and a key move here, not queen h8 because there's bishop f8, but a key move which creates some coordination with this bishop and queen. Bishop g6 for queen h8, and there's coordination on e8 there, which will be checkmate. This position, pause if needed. Blackburn. Rook takes. If king takes, there was a lethal double check. Now here, rook takes h2, check, and it's going to be a back row mate there. Here, black to play. Wishy Allen playing black against the great Vladimir Kramnik. Pause if needed. Queen f3, threatening rook h1, mating. Okay, so that's check, unveiling a check. Where does the king go? g5 or f5? In fact, it does make a difference. King f5 is best to stop any queen d8, tactical queen d8. This is, the form pawn is winning. It's cutting away escape squares. If the king makes a run for it, rook h1, the form pawn is covering e2. There's nothing white can do here. If king g5, let's have a look at that. Taking first, then check gives white some hope. And it's probably a draw. Okay. So it's important sometimes to avoid being checked. Now here, white to play, if you want to pause. Okay, the king's really lacking in there. Queen takes a8, rook e8. Nice simple back row mate there, compared to some of the other examples. And here, even simpler. Can you guess? Pause here if needed. Form pawn is covering key escape squares as well. Queen takes h8, rook takes. And one last example to reinforce the concept. Okay, bishop e6 check, and there's no escape now after queen h8 checkmate. So the back row mate is a celebration of lack of escape squares, and in general, if you can restrict the opponent's king escape squares, you should be looking out for checkmates and celebrating that. That's really a tactical liability in its own right, in a general sense, when there's a lack of escape squares. You've basically constructed a partial mating net. There are these pointers for a lot of these tactics, clues that something is up. The classic one is like loose pieces. Another classic in general is king safety. Yeah, lack of escape squares is a big one celebrated with the back row mate tactic in particular. But yeah, try and, if you abstract the generalities of it, what's causing the back row mate, it's the lack of escape squares. And these are the clues which should make you more aware that things do exist in the position, and maybe take a bit more time to find the absolute strongest moves to celebrate those factors. Okay. Yeah, you can check out these from the improved menu, as it says here. Go to chessworld.net, register, login, improved menu, puzzle books, and you'll see lots of these puzzle books. And this is the latest in the series of this playlist, Secrets of Chess Tactics, which you might want to look up and review the others. There's a bit of reinforcement learning as well going on. You might have seen some of these before, but hopefully you'll get quicker and quicker at spotting the winning combinations of that in similar positions. Okay, thanks very much.